I didn't think my anniversary morning would be the day I finally understood where I ranked in my family, but that's exactly what it turned into. I walked into a coffee shop expecting something small, quiet, maybe even a little awkward, but sincere. Instead, I walked into a full-blown planning meeting for my younger brother's road trip, complete with maps spread across the table, phones out, and my parents arguing about gas mileage like they were prepping for a military operation. Nobody looked up. Nobody smiled. And nobody said the one thing I had assumed would be impossible to forget. For context, I'm Edward, 32, married for 3 years, together with my wife for almost a decade. This wasn't some huge milestone anniversary like 10 or 20 years. It wasn't a vow renewal or anything dramatic. It was just our anniversary. The kind where you grab coffee in the morning, maybe exchange a card, maybe laugh about how tired you are before work. Simple. Low expectations. Or so I thought. My relationship with my parents has always been uneven. They're not monsters. They're not the kind of parents who scream or throw things or disappear for years. They're just very, very good at making it clear who matters most without ever saying it out loud. That honor has always belonged to my younger brother, Jason. He's 28, charming in that effortless way, and somehow always in the middle of some big plan that needs everyone's attention. A new job idea, a move, a trip, a phase. There's always something. Growing up, I learned early that Jason was the exciting one, and I was the reliable one. He needed encouragement. I needed to understand. He needed support. I needed to be patient. When he forgot birthdays, it was brushed off. When I remembered everyone else's, it was expected. I didn't hate him for it. For a long time, I told myself this was just how families worked. When I got married, I honestly thought things might shift a little. Not dramatically, but enough that I'd be seen as my own person instead of just the older brother. My wife noticed the imbalance before I fully admitted it to myself. She never pushed me to confront it. She just quietly observed, the way someone does when they love you and don't want to hurt you by pointing out something you're not ready to face. The coffee meetup was my idea. My parents had texted earlier in the week asking if we could do something quick since they'd be busy later that day. They didn't mention the anniversary in that text, but I assumed it was implied. I replied with the name of a small cafe near their house, one we'd gone to plenty of times before. Neutral territory. Easy parking. Nothing fancy. They agreed immediately. That should have been my first clue. That morning, my wife wished me happy anniversary, kissed me on the cheek, and handed me a small envelope. I told her we'd open cards later, after coffee. She smiled, but there was something careful in her expression, like she was bracing herself for something. I didn't ask. I grabbed my jacket and told her I'd be back in an hour. When I walked into the cafe, I spotted them right away. Same table, near the window. My mom's purse on the chair. My dad leaning back, glasses on his nose. Jason sitting between them, animated, tapping at his phone. The table was covered in napkins with scribbles, a folded paper map, and at least 3 different travel apps open on their screens. I stood there for a second, waiting for someone to notice me. It took longer than it should have. "Oh, hey," my dad said finally, glancing up like I'd just walked into the wrong meeting. "You're here." I smiled, because that's what I always do. "Yeah, morning." My mom gave me a quick hug that felt more like a reflex than a greeting. "We just got here a bit early," she said, already turning back to Jason. He's trying to figure out if it makes more sense to go north first or cut across the state line. Jason barely looked up. "If I go north, I can hit 3 national parks, but then the gas cost." "You could always shorten it," my mom said. "But you don't want to rush. This is your big trip." I sat down, setting my coffee on the edge of the table where there was barely any room. I waited. I told myself they'd remember in a second, that someone would suddenly pause and say it, that my mom would gasp and reach across the table, that my dad would grin awkwardly and make a joke about how time flies. Nothing. They kept talking. About campsites. About toll roads. About whether Jason should bring a cooler or just eat out. I listened to them debate routes with the intensity of people planning a life-altering decision, while my presence slowly faded into the background. I tried to insert myself once, making a comment about a road he'd taken before that was always under construction. My dad nodded absently and went right back to discussing hotel points. A few minutes in, my mom turned to me and asked, "Did you want something to eat?" It wasn't a happy anniversary. It wasn't even a "how are you?" It was a practical question, like she'd just noticed an empty seat needed managing. I'm fine, I said. I watched the clock on my phone tick forward. 10 minutes. 15. Jason laughed about how he might accidentally extend the trip if he found a cool town. My parents laughed with him, like the idea of him being gone longer was charming instead of inconvenient. That's when it hit me, slow and heavy. They hadn't forgotten. They just hadn't thought it mattered enough to acknowledge. I thought about my wife at home, probably checking the time, probably already guessing how this was going. I thought about how carefully I'd kept my expectations low, and how even then, I'd somehow managed to overestimate what this morning meant to them. I cleared my throat. So, I said, forcing my voice to stay light. Big plans today, huh? My mom smiled at me, distracted. For Jason, yeah. This trip is such a good opportunity for him. He really needs this. Needs this. The word stuck with me. I nodded slowly, fingers tightening around my coffee cup. Right. There was a moment then, a brief pause in the conversation, where I could have said it. I could have reminded them. I could have pointed out what day it was. The familiar fork in the road appeared, the one I'd faced my entire life. Speak up and risk being labeled dramatic, or stay quiet and absorb it. Before I could decide, my dad leaned forward, tapping the map. If you leave Friday morning instead of Thursday night, you avoid traffic completely. Jason looked pleased. That's genius, Dad. I sat there, listening to them plan his escape, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. Not yet. More like a quiet, sinking realization that this wasn't a one-off mistake. This was a pattern playing out in real time, and I was finally too tired to pretend I didn't see it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my wife. I didn't look at it right away. I just stared at the table, at the maps and the notes and the empty space where my anniversary should have been, and I wondered how many more moments like this I'd let slide before something finally broke. I didn't say anything that morning. That's the part that still bothers me when I replay it in my head. I smiled, nodded, made a few neutral comments, and finished my coffee while my parents enthusiastically planned a trip that somehow required more emotional investment than my marriage ever had. When I stood up to leave, my mom said, "Text us later," like this had been a perfectly normal visit. Jason gave me a distracted wave. No one mentioned the anniversary. Not once. When I got home, my wife was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs and the envelopes still unopened between them. She looked up at me, read my face in about half a second, and didn't ask how it went. She already knew. She just slid 1 mug toward me and said, softly, "They forgot, didn't they?" I nodded. That was all I could manage. She didn't get angry. She didn't rant. That almost made it worse. She just exhaled slowly, the way someone does when something disappointing but unsurprising finally confirms itself. "I'm sorry," she said. And for the first time that day, I felt seen. I told myself it was just coffee, that anniversaries weren't a big deal, that they'd call later and apologize, maybe even laugh about it. I clung to that idea longer than I should have. But hours passed. Then the whole day. Then the next. Nothing. The silence did something to me. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, corrosive. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach tightened. Every time it wasn't them, something sank a little deeper. 2 days later, my mom called like nothing was wrong. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, cheerful. "Quick question." I already knew where this was going. "Jason's trip is coming up, and we were wondering if you could help him out a bit. You're better with logistics and budgeting. Maybe sit down with him, help him plan stops, figure out costs." I gripped the phone harder than necessary. "Did you want to talk about anything else first?" There was a pause. A short one. Calculated. Like what? I waited. I gave her space. Surely now. Surely this was where she'd realize. "Oh," she said eventually, like she'd just remembered to pick up milk. "Happy anniversary, by the way." I knew it was around this time. Around this time. I felt my jaw tighten. "It was 2 days ago." "Well, you know what I mean," she replied lightly. "You're married adults now. We didn't think you made a big deal out of it." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly on brand. When Jason forgot things, it was because he was spontaneous. When I cared about things, it was because I was sensitive. "I'm actually busy," I said. "I can't help Jason plan right now." Her tone shifted immediately. "Busy with what?" "With my life," I said. "With my wife. With work. With things that matter to me." She sighed, the familiar disappointed parent sigh. "Edward, don't be like that. He really needs support. This trip means a lot to him." That phrase again. Needs. Means a lot. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said I'd call her back later and ended the conversation. My hands were shaking when I put the phone down. Not with rage, but with the exhaustion of someone who's been bending for years and finally feels a crack forming. Over the next few weeks, the favoritism stopped being subtle. Jason came up in every conversation. My parents sent group messages about his itinerary, photos of gear they'd bought him, links to hotels they thought he'd love. My wife's name didn't appear once. Neither did mine, unless it was followed by a request. Then came the dinner invite. My dad texted, "Family dinner this Sunday. Important. Please come." Important was a loaded word in my family. It usually meant Jason had news, or needed help, or wanted something celebrated. Still, I went. Part of me wanted to believe this was a chance for them to make things right, or at least acknowledge what they'd ignored. Sunday evening, my wife and I arrived at my parents' house. The table was set nicely. Too nicely. My mom hugged us, my dad poured drinks, and Jason was already there, sitting at the head of the table like he belonged there. There was an energy in the room that made my skin prickle. Anticipation. Not for me. Dinner started normally enough. Small talk. Work updates. My mom complimented Jason's jacket. My dad asked him about his route again. When my wife spoke, she was polite, careful, gracious in a way that made me ache with appreciation. Halfway through the meal, my dad cleared his throat. "So," he said, smiling at Jason, "we wanted to talk about something as a family. Here we go." Jason leaned back, arms crossed, looking pleased. My mom folded her hands together like she was about to announce a pregnancy or a promotion. "As you know," my dad continued, "Jason's trip is coming up. It's going to be expensive. And your mother and I have been thinking." My stomach tightened. "We want to help him," my mom said. "Really help him. Not just with advice." Jason nodded, already nodding before she finished. My dad looked at me then, directly. "Edward, you're more stable financially. You've always been good with money. Responsible." There it was. The setup. "We were wondering," my mom added, "if you'd be willing to loan Jason some money, just to make the trip less stressful. We're not talking about a gift. Just support." I stared at them. "How much?" My dad named a number. It wasn't small. It was more than I'd ever loaned anyone casually. More than they'd ever given me for anything. "And what about his savings?" I asked. Jason scoffed. "Why would I drain my savings for an experience like this?" I felt something snap then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a clean break inside my chest. "You want me to fund his road trip?" I said slowly. "After you ignored my anniversary, didn't acknowledge my wife, and spent weeks acting like my life doesn't exist." My mom frowned. "That's not fair. This isn't about you." That sentence landed harder than anything else she could have said. "Then what is it about?" I asked quietly. "It's about family," she replied. "About supporting each other." I looked around the table. At the plates. At the wine glasses. At the way my wife's hand had tightened around her fork. "Funny," I said. "I don't feel very supported." Jason rolled his eyes. "Why are you making this dramatic?" "It's just money." I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone froze. My wife looked up at me, concern and something else in her eyes. Relief, maybe. Or readiness. "I'm not doing this," I said. "I'm not paying for your trip. I'm not pretending this is normal. And I'm not sitting here while you all act like I'm a resource instead of a person." My dad's face hardened. "Sit down, Edward." "No." My mom's voice trembled. "You're really going to do this now? Over a forgotten anniversary?" I laughed then. A short, hollow sound. It was never just the anniversary. I grabbed my jacket. My wife stood with me without hesitation. As we turned to leave, my dad said something that stopped me cold. "If you walk out now," he said, "don't expect things to go back to the way they were." I turned around slowly. They already aren't. We left. The door closed behind us with a finality that echoed through the quiet street. In the car, neither of us spoke for a few minutes. Then my wife reached for my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. I nodded, staring ahead, my heart pounding. I thought that was the breaking point. I thought walking out was the climax. I thought the worst thing they could do was demand money and dismiss my feelings. I was wrong. Because 2 days later, I got an email from my father's address. Attached was a document I had never expected to see, and the subject line made my blood run cold. I stared at that email for a long time before I opened the attachment. Long enough that my coffee went cold. Long enough that my wife noticed something was wrong just by the way I was sitting there, unmoving, staring at the screen like it might blink first. The subject line was short, Clinical. Almost polite. Family financial adjustment. That wording alone told me everything I needed to know about my father's mindset. He never did anything emotionally. Everything with him was framed like a business decision, even when it involved his own children. When I finally opened the document, my chest tightened in a way that felt physical. It was a formal-looking PDF, clearly drafted with help, outlining changes to what they referred to as previously discussed family support arrangements. Translation: money, control. Strings I hadn't even realized were still attached. Buried in the paragraphs was the real message. Because I had chosen to distance myself from family unity and refused to support a sibling in need, they were reevaluating their future plans regarding inheritance, assistance, and any financial backing they had once considered for me. It didn't outright say I was cut off. It didn't need to. The implication was clear: comply or be erased. I felt sick. Not because of the money itself. My wife and I weren't dependent on them. We had our own lives, our own income, our own plans. What broke me was the realization that my parents saw our relationship as transactional, that everything they'd ever offered had been conditional, waiting for the moment I stepped out of line. When my wife read it, she didn't speak right away. She just closed the laptop gently and looked at me. "They're punishing you," she said finally. "Because you said no." I nodded. My throat felt tight. "They're trying to scare me back into place." That night was rough. I barely slept. My mind replayed every interaction from childhood through adulthood, reframing them through this new lens. The gifts, the help, the praise when I complied, the withdrawal when I didn't. It was like realizing you'd been living in a house with invisible walls, and you'd finally run into one hard enough to see it. Over the next few weeks, things got worse before they got better. My parents stopped calling. Completely. No check-ins. No casual updates. Just silence. Jason, on the other hand, suddenly found the time to message me. "You didn't have to embarrass Mom and Dad like that," he wrote. "They were just trying to help me out." I didn't respond. Then came the extended family. An aunt asking why I was being difficult. A cousin telling me I should apologize to keep the peace. Everyone seemed to know their version of the story already. One where I was selfish, ungrateful, dramatic. That's when the real fall happened. Not one big crash, but a slow erosion of certainty. I started questioning myself, wondering if I'd overreacted, if I'd been too sensitive, if walking out had been a mistake. At work, I was distracted. At home, quieter than usual. My wife noticed. She never accused, never pushed. She just stayed close, grounding me when my thoughts spiraled. One evening, after a particularly rough day, I finally said out loud what I'd been afraid to admit. What if they're right? What if I am the problem? She turned to me fully, eyes steady. "Edward, listen to me. If setting a boundary causes this much backlash, the boundary wasn't the problem. The system was." Something in that clicked. I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to earn a baseline level of respect that should have been automatic. I'd been negotiating for scraps of acknowledgement, calling it love because I didn't know what else to call it. That realization hurt. A lot. But it was also clarifying. The next few months were quiet. Painfully so. No family gatherings. No updates about Jason's trip, except the occasional social media post that slipped through before I muted him. Photos of smiling parents, scenic overlooks, captions about making memories. I stopped looking. Instead, I started focusing inward. Not in some dramatic, self-help book way. Just small, deliberate choices. I poured more energy into my marriage. My wife and I started taking long walks in the evenings, talking about everything we'd put off while life was busy. I opened up to her in ways I hadn't before, admitting how much I'd tied my self-worth to my parents' approval. At work, I asked for projects I'd previously passed up because I didn't want to rock the boat. I stayed late when it mattered. I spoke up in meetings. Slowly, my confidence started to come back, not because someone validated me, but because I was finally validating myself. One night, while organizing old files, I came across paperwork from years ago, things I'd signed without much thought at the time. Agreements, accounts, notes from conversations where my parents had offered help just in case. I read them differently now. There were clauses, conditions, language that assumed continued involvement, continued access. I realized that my father hadn't just been a controlling parent. He'd been a strategic one, always thinking 10 steps ahead, always ensuring leverage. Instead of panicking, I did something I'd never done before. I booked a consultation with a financial advisor, then a lawyer, not to attack anyone, just to understand where I stood. Those meetings were sobering, empowering, terrifying. I learned which ties were real and which were imagined, which obligations were emotional and which were legal. I learned that some of the power I'd assumed my parents held over me existed only because I'd never questioned it. I didn't tell my parents any of this. I didn't threaten. I didn't announce. I just quietly began restructuring my life so that no one could pull the rug out from under me again. During this time, Jason's trip ended. He came back full of stories and photos and opinions. My parents hosted a welcome-back dinner. We weren't invited. That stung more than I expected, even though I'd seen it coming. A week later, my mom finally called. Her voice was softer than usual. "Careful. We haven't heard from you in a while." I almost laughed. Almost. "I've been busy," I said. "With what?" she asked. "With building a life that doesn't depend on being approved of." There was a long silence. Then she said, "Your father thinks you're making a mistake." "I know," I replied. "He always does." She hesitated. "We're still your parents." "I know," I said again. "But I'm not your project." We ended the call politely. No yelling. No resolution. Just an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. After that, something unexpected happened. The anger faded. Not completely, but enough to make room for something steadier. Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that comes from knowing you stood up for yourself and survived the consequences. I started sleeping better, laughing more, feeling lighter. And that's when an opportunity came up. One that tied directly back to the assumptions my parents had always made about me. One that, if I handled it right, would change the balance of power permanently. When I opened the email outlining it, my hands didn't shake this time. I smiled. The email sat in my inbox for 3 days before I did anything with it. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I did. Too clearly. It was one of those messages that looks harmless to anyone skimming it, but if you read between the lines, it changes how you see your entire future. It was from a former colleague who had moved into a senior role at a firm I'd worked with years ago. We'd stayed in light contact, the kind that consists of polite check-ins and the occasional congratulatory message on LinkedIn. Apparently, someone had remembered me, not as the reliable son or the reasonable one, but as someone competent, valuable. They wanted me to come in for a conversation. Not an interview, exactly. A discussion about a role they were quietly creating. One with influence. One with equity. One that would put me in a position I'd never imagined for myself when I was still measuring my worth by how useful I was to my parents. I didn't tell my wife right away. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed time to let it become real in my own head first. For once, I wanted something to be mine before it became part of the shared narrative of our lives. In the meantime, my family's behavior shifted again. My parents didn't apologize, but the tone changed. Messages became cautiously friendly. My mom sent a photo of a dessert she'd made, like a peace offering disguised as baked goods. My dad forwarded an article related to my field with a short, "Thought you'd find this interesting." No acknowledgement of the email. No mention of the dinner we hadn't been invited to. Just a slow, tentative reach. Jason, on the other hand, grew louder. He started posting vague comments online about fake support and people who think they're better than family. He messaged me late one night, accusing me of turning mom and dad against him just because I didn't want to help. I didn't respond to any of it. Silence, I'd learned, was powerful. It forced people to sit with their own noise. Behind the scenes, I was preparing. Not in a dramatic, confrontational way. Methodically, carefully, the way my father always had, except without the cruelty. I met with that colleague for coffee, then lunch, then a formal meeting with 2 other partners. Each conversation peeled back another layer of what they were offering. It wasn't just a job. It was a stake, a seat at the table. They wanted someone steady, someone who understood long-term planning, someone who didn't burn bridges, but also didn't bend under pressure. I thought of my parents, of how often they'd praised me for those exact qualities when it suited them, of how quickly they tried to weaponize them when I stopped complying. I accepted the role 2 weeks later. The relief wasn't immediate. Instead, it came in waves. The first was quiet satisfaction. The second was a deeper, steadier confidence. The third was something else entirely, clarity. Because once I knew where I was headed, I could see exactly how much leverage my parents had lost. That's when I started putting pieces into place. Not revenge in the explosive sense, I wasn't interested in yelling matches or public confrontations. I wanted something cleaner, something undeniable. I wanted the truth to surface naturally, without me having to force it. The first step was documentation. I went back through years of emails, messages, and paperwork. Every offer of help, every conditional promise, every instance where support was framed as generosity but structured as control. I organized everything chronologically, not for court, but for myself, to remind me that I hadn't imagined this pattern. It was real, consistent, deliberate. The second step was boundaries. When my mom called again, asking if we could reset and have dinner, I agreed. But on my terms. Neutral location. My wife included. No Jason. She hesitated at that last part, but eventually agreed. At dinner, they were on their best behavior. Compliments. Careful questions. My dad even asked about my work, genuinely listening in a way he hadn't in years. I answered politely, but vaguely. I didn't offer details. I didn't invite opinions. At one point, my mom reached across the table and said, "We just want things to be like they used to be." I looked at her hand on mine and gently moved my fingers away. "I don't." She blinked, confused. "I want things to be better," I continued. "And that can't happen if we pretend nothing was wrong." My dad's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. That was new. The third step was allies. I didn't broadcast my situation, but I stopped hiding it. When extended family reached out with passive-aggressive messages, I calmly corrected misinformation. When a cousin implied I was being selfish, I asked what exactly I'd done wrong and waited. Most people backed off when pressed for specifics. One aunt surprised me. She called one afternoon and said, "I don't know what's really going on, but I see how they treat Jason compared to you. I always have." She didn't take sides publicly, but her quiet support mattered more than she knew. Then came the unexpected twist. My father asked to meet me alone. He framed it as concern, said he was worried about distance and misunderstandings. We met in his office, a space I'd spent countless hours in growing up, absorbing his worldview without realizing it. He didn't waste time. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I have." He leaned back, studying me like a problem he hadn't solved yet. "You're risking a lot by pushing us away." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm not pushing you away. I'm stepping out of a role you assigned me without my consent." That annoyed him. I could tell. He liked control. He liked predictability. And I was no longer either. He tried one last angle. "Jason is struggling. He needs family." "So did I," I said quietly. "For years." That landed. Not because it softened him, but because it challenged his narrative. He ended the meeting shortly after, clearly unsettled. As I walked out, I realized something important. This wasn't just about money, or trips, or anniversaries. It was about identity. My family had decided who I was supposed to be, and my refusal to play that part threatened the entire structure. That's when I knew the moment was coming. A collision point where all of this would surface, whether I pushed it or not. And then, as if on cue, my mom called me one evening, her voice tight with urgency. "Edward," she said, "we need to talk. Jason made a decision, and it affects all of us." I closed my eyes, already sensing that whatever this was, it would force everything into the open. "Okay," I said calmly. "When?" "Tomorrow," she replied. "Family meeting." I agreed, not because I was nervous, but because I was ready. And as I hung up the phone, I knew that whatever they thought they were about to confront me with, they had no idea how much ground had already shifted beneath their feet. The family meeting took place at my parents' house, the same dining room where I'd learned, years ago, how to sit quietly and make myself smaller. Walking back into that space felt surreal. Not because it scared me anymore, but because I could finally see it clearly for what it was, a stage where the same play had been performed over and over, with me cast in the same role every time. This time, I wasn't playing it. Jason was already there when my wife and I arrived. He looked agitated, pacing near the window, phone in hand. My parents sat stiffly at the table, my mother wringing her fingers, my father unusually silent. No one offered drinks. No one made small talk. The tension was thick enough to feel like pressure on my chest. My mom gestured for us to sit. "We'll get right to it," she said, voice tight. Jason made a decision without fully understanding the consequences. Jason stopped pacing and looked at me, irritation flashing across his face. "You didn't have to take it this far," he said immediately. I raised an eyebrow. "I don't even know what this is yet." My dad cleared his throat. Jason took out a loan. That alone didn't surprise me. Jason had always lived slightly ahead of his means, confident that something or someone would catch him if he fell. A large one, my mom added. Jason crossed his arms. It was an investment. In what? My wife asked calmly. Jason hesitated. A startup. A travel-adjacent platform. It was supposed to launch while I was on the road. Passive income. I nodded slowly. Supposed to. My father slid a folder across the table toward me. The problem, he said, is that the loan was secured. I opened the folder. As I read, everything clicked into place with chilling clarity. Jason had used my parents' home as collateral. Not with my knowledge. Not with my consent. But with theirs. I looked up slowly. You let him do this? My mom's eyes filled with tears. We didn't think it would be a problem. He was confident. He said the returns were guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed, my wife said quietly. Jason snapped. You don't understand. If Edward had just helped me like they asked, I wouldn't have needed to do this. I laughed. Not sharply. Not cruelly. Just a soft, incredulous sound. So let me get this straight. You took out a massive loan, put mom and dad's house on the line, and now this is somehow my fault. My dad's jaw clenched. We assumed that as family, you'd step in if things got complicated. There it was. The assumption laid bare. I was still the safety net. Still the backup plan. Still the one expected to absorb the impact of Jason's choices. I closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. I'm not stepping in. The words landed like a dropped plate. My mom gasped. Edward, please. If this falls through, then it falls through, I said evenly. Jason exploded. You can't do that. You make more than enough. You're just being petty now. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. No, I'm being consistent. I said I wouldn't fund your life anymore. This is your life. My father slammed his hand on the table. Enough. This is serious. If the loan defaults, we lose the house. I took a slow breath. This was the moment. The one where old me would have folded, would have panicked, would have agreed to anything just to keep the peace. Instead, I said, I know. Silence followed. Heavy. Expectant. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder. I came prepared. I continued. Because I figured this meeting wouldn't be about accountability. It would be about pressure. I slid my documents across the table. My parents stared as I explained. Months earlier, after receiving my father's family financial adjustment email, I had taken steps. I'd formally severed any remaining financial entanglements, removed myself from legacy plans, shared accounts, and informal agreements that had never benefited me anyway. I had also updated my will, my beneficiaries, and my emergency contacts. My parents were no longer on any of it. But more importantly, I'd done something else. I was offered a partnership, I said calmly. One that's public now. You can look it up. Jason scoffed. So what? So, I replied, when you took out that loan, you assumed I'd be your bailout. You assumed mom and dad could leverage me. That assumption is wrong. My father stared at the papers, realization dawning slowly. You planned this. I planned my independence, I corrected. The timing is yours. My mom looked stricken. Are you saying you won't help us at all? I met her eyes, and for the first time, didn't feel the need to soften the truth. I'm saying I won't sacrifice my family to enable Jason's choices. There's a difference. Jason stood abruptly. You're choosing money over blood. I shook my head. I'm choosing responsibility over manipulation. The fallout was immediate. Jason ranted, accused, pleaded. He promised he'd fix it, that the investment was just delayed, that he needed time. My parents argued in hushed, frantic tones, cycling between panic and denial. I stayed seated, calm, grounded. Eventually, my father spoke again, voice strained. If we lose the house. You won't, I said. Not if you act now. They looked at me sharply. There are options, I continued. Sell the second car. Downsize temporarily. Renegotiate. What there isn't anymore is me quietly cleaning up messes you refuse to confront. Jason stared at me like I'd betrayed him. Maybe, in his mind, I had. But something unexpected happened next. My mother straightened in her chair. Slowly, like someone waking up from a long sleep. She looked at Jason, really looked at him, and said, What did you do? He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he had no answer that worked. The truth landed hard. Over the next few weeks, everything unraveled exactly as it should have. The startup failed. The loan was renegotiated, painfully. My parents sold assets they'd never imagined parting with. Jason moved back in with them, humbled in a way I'd never seen before. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't announce anything. I just kept living. The calls slowed, then stopped. Extended family stopped lecturing once the full story came out. Turns out people are less eager to take sides when the golden child burns the house down himself. Months later, my mom reached out again. Not to ask for money, not to demand anything, just to say, "I'm sorry. We should have seen you." I thanked her and meant it. Our relationship now is different, smaller, more honest. Jason and I are distant, but civil. My father no longer tries to negotiate my choices. He knows better now. As for my wife and me, we celebrated our next anniversary quietly. No family, no obligations, just coffee, laughter, and the kind of peace that comes from finally choosing yourself. I used to think revenge had to be loud to be satisfying, that it meant winning or proving something. I was wrong. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to carry what was never yours to hold, and walking away without looking back.